One day, while a number of Confederate women were thus engaged in a New Orleans cemetery, they crossed to the graves of the Union dead and placed flowers upon them. This touching and noble act inspired the late Judge Francis M. Finch of New York to write his beautiful poem, The Blue and the Gray. By the flow of the inland river whence the fleets of iron have fled, where the blades of the grave grass quiver, asleep are the ranks of the dead. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day. Under the one, the blue. Under the other, the gray.
November 6th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president.
December 20th, 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Within 2 months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas secede as well.
February 9th, 1861, Confederate States are formed with Jefferson Davis.
The chair recognizes the senator from Mississippi.
Mr. President of the Senate, Senators, I appear here.
March 4th, 1861, Abraham is sworn in as the 16th president.
April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Pierre Beauregard led the Confederates and fired 50 cannons upon Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Civil War begins.
April 14th, 1861, Fort Sumter is captured from the rebel bombardment of 3,000 shells.
April 15, 1861, President Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 militiamen and summoning a special session of Congress for July 4th.
July 21st, 1861, the Union suffers a defeat at Bull Run. The Union is now understanding how long this war will last.
November 8, 1861, 2 Confederates sailed towards England but were seized by the U.S. Navy.
February 6, 1862, victory for General Ulysses S. Grant in Tennessee, capturing Fort Henry and 10 days later Fort Donelson. Grant earns the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant.
In March, the Peninsular Campaign begins as McLean's Army of the Potomac advances from Washington down to the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay to the peninsular south of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, then begins an advance towards Richmond.
April 6 through 7, 1862, Confederate surprise attack on General Ulysses S. Grant's unprepared troops at Shiloh on the Tennessee River results in a bitter struggle with 13,000 Union killed and wounded and 10,000 Confederates, more men than in all previous American wars combined. The president is pressured to relieve Grant but resists. "I can't spare this man, he fights," Lincoln says.
May 31st, 1862. The Battle of Seven Pines as General Joseph E. Johnston's army attacks McLean's troops in front of Richmond and nearly defeats them, but Johnston is badly wounded.
June 25th through July 1st, 1862. At the 7 Days Battle, Lee attacks McLean near Richmond, resulting in very heavy losses for both armies. McLean then begins a withdrawal back toward Washington. Young Georgia Private Edwin Jensen was killed in the 7-day battle at Malvern Hill. He was the face of the lost generation.
August 29th through 30th, 1862, 75,000 Federals under General John Pope are defeated by 55,000 Confederates under General Stonewall Jackson and General James Longstreet at the Second Battle of Bull Run in northern Virginia. Once again, the Union Army retreats into Washington. The President then relieves Pope.
September 4th through 9th, 1862, Lee invades the North with 50,000 Confederates and heads for Harper's Ferry, located 50 miles northwest of Washington.
September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day in U.S. military history, as General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate armies are stopped at Antietam in Maryland by McLean and numerically superior Union forces. By nightfall, 26,000 men are dead, wounded, or missing. Lee then withdraws to Virginia. September 22, 1862, preliminary Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves issued by President Lincoln.
December 13th, 1862, Army of the Potomac under General Burnside suffers a costly defeat at Fredericksburg in Virginia with a loss of 12,653 men after 14 frontal assaults on well-entrenched rebels on Marye's Heights. "We might as well have tried to take Hal," a Union soldier remarks. Confederate losses are 5,309.
March 3, 1863. The U.S. Congress enacts a draft affecting male citizens aged 20 to 45, but also exempting those who pay $300 or provide a substitute. "The blood of a poor man is as precious as that of the wealthy," poor Northerners complained.
May 1st through 4th, 1863, The Union Army under General Hooker is decisively defeated by Lee's much smaller forces at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia as a result of Lee's brilliant and daring tactics. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson is mortally wounded by his own soldiers. Hooker retreats. Union losses are 17,000 killed, wounded, and missing out of 130,000. The Confederates, 13,000 out of 60,000. "I just lost confidence in Joe Hooker," said Hooker later about his own lack of nerve during the battle. Confederate soldiers at the Sunken Road killed during the fighting around Chancellorsville.
May 10th, 1863. The South suffers a huge blow as Stonewall Jackson dies from his wounds. His last words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." "I have lost my right arm," Lee laments.
June 3rd, 1863. General Lee, with 75,000 Confederates, launches his second invasion of the North, heading to Pennsylvania in a campaign that will soon lead to Gettysburg.
July 1st through 3rd, 1863. The tide of war turns against the South as Confederates are defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania.
July 4th, 1863. Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, surrenders to General Grant and the Army of the West after a 6-week siege. With the Union now in control of the Mississippi, the Confederacy is effectively split in two, cut off from its Western allies.
July 13th through 16th, 1863. Anti-draft riots in New York City include arson and the murder of blacks by poor immigrant whites. At least 120 persons, including children, are killed and $2 million in damage caused. The Union soldiers returning from Gettysburg restore order. September 19th through 20th, 1863, a decisive Confederate victory by General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee at Chickamauga leaves General William S. Rosecrans' Union Army of Cumberland trapped in Chattanooga, Tennessee, under Confederate siege.
November 19, 1863, President Lincoln delivers a 2-minute Gettysburg address at a ceremony dedicating the battlefield as a national cemetery.
May 4th, 1864, the beginning of a massive coordinated campaign involving all the Union armies. In Virginia, Grant, with an army of 120,000, begins advancing towards Richmond to engage Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, now numbering 64,000, beginning a war of attrition that will include major battles at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor.
June 3, 1864, a costly mistake by Grant results in 7,000 Union casualties in 20 minutes during an offensive against fortified rebels at Cold Harbor in Virginia.
September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta is captured by Sherman's army. "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," Sherman telegraphs Lincoln. The victory greatly helps President Lincoln bid for re-election. October 19th, 1864, a decisive Union victory won by Cavalry General Philip H. Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley over Jubal Early's troops.
November 8, 1864, Abraham Lincoln is re-elected president, defeating Democrat George B. McLean. Lincoln carries all but 3 states with 55% of the popular vote and 212 of 233 electoral votes. I earnestly believe that the consequences of this day's work will be to the lasting advantage, if not the very salvation of the country, Lincoln tells supporters.
December 15th through 16th, 1864, Hood's rebel army of 23,000 is crushed at Nashville by 55,000 Federals, including black troops under General George H. Thomas. The Confederate Army of Tennessee ceases as an effective fighting force. January 31st, 1865. The U.S. Congress approves the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution to abolish slavery. The amendment is then submitted to the states for ratification. February 3rd, 1865. A peace conference occurs as President Lincoln meets with Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens at Hampton Roads in Virginia. But the meeting ends in failure. The war will continue.
March 25, 1865, the last defense for Lee's Army of Northern Virginia begins with an attack on the center of Grant's forces at Petersburg. 4 hours later, the attack is broken.
April 2nd, 1865. Grant's forces begin a general advance and break through Lee's line at Petersburg. Confederate General Ambrose P. Hill is killed. Lee evacuates Petersburg. The Confederate capital, Richmond, is evacuated. Fires and looting break out. The next day, Union troops enter and raise the Stars and Stripes. April 9th, 1865. General Robert E. Lee surrenders his Confederate army to General Ulysses S. Grant at the village of Approximate Courthouse in Virginia. Grant allows rebel officers to keep their sidearms and permits soldiers to keep horses and mules. April 14th, 1865. The Stars and Stripes is ceremoniously raised over Fort Sumter. That night, Lincoln and his wife Mary see the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. At 10:13 p.m., during the third act of the play, John Wilkes Booth shoots the president in the head. Doctors attend to the president in the theater, then move him to a house across the street. He never regains consciousness. April 15th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln dies at 7:22 in the morning. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency. April 18th, 1865. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston surrenders to Sherman near Durham in North Carolina. April 26th, 1865. John Wilkes Booth is shot and killed in a tobacco barn in Virginia. May 4th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln is laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery outside Springfield, Illinois. In May, remaining Confederate forces surrender. The nation is reunited as the Civil War ends. Over 620,000 Americans died in the war, with disease killing twice as many as those lost in the battle. 50,000 survivors return home as amputees.
I've made up my mind over and over. Keep pressing rewind, but I'm getting older. Tried every door, don't know who I'm looking for. And I've made up my mind